Great, we're done with the program. I believe that the knowledge you have now, you can go and illustrate pretty much anything you want. But before you do that, I have a few tips that I've compiled together through the years of illustrating with Inkscape. Some of them are small features that can save you a lot of time, others are just tips for working with the program. Either way, these tips are really basic. But to me, they are very important to know. I want to start with some very important stuff. I believe that in most tutorials, for the most part, everyone forgets about one of the most important parts of working in Inkscape, switching between the two selection tools. And switching between these two tools is one of the most common actions you'll be doing when drawing. At the end of a day's work, you'll end up wasting a ton of time moving the mouse to the toolbox to switch to the right tool. It's a little like when you're learning a 3D program, and everyone tells you that you should get used to the keyboard shortcuts to the manipulator tools as early as possible. Otherwise you'll be forever slave to moving the mouse all the way to the UI every 2 seconds. The default shortcuts are a little bit awkward to my taste. The toolbox is set to the function keys F1, F2, F3, so I prefer to set my own custom shortcuts. You can edit the default shortcuts if you go to Edit, Preferences. Here you go to Interface, Keyboard Shortcuts. The tools are in the context list. Or you can search in the search box. I recommend you to set the selection tools to something like A and S or Q and W, something that is not as separated from the rest of the default non-toolbox keyboard shortcuts. And since you're there, you might as well set the shortcut to the next most used tools. You'll be using the pen tool a lot, so I recommend you to set a comfortable shortcut for it. And very important, a tool you'll be switching to constantly, the dropper tool. The dropper allows you to sample a color and set it to the fill, or if you hold shift, the stroke of the selected object. In most other programs, the dropper tool is assigned by default to a key like Ctrl or Alt, but in Inkscape, the dropper is a tool, so you need to use a shortcut to access it. And you should use a very comfortable key, something that won't force you to go all the way up in the keyboard every time you want to sample a color. If you don't set a shortcut, then you're either gonna have to go to the toolbox every time, or open the fill and stroke dialog and use the dropper icon there. Both very slow and awkward. This tip can save you hours of adjusting properties in dialogues. It is possible to copy and paste only the style of an object. This means that you can pass on the fill and stroke color as well as the stroke width and other properties to any other object, and the object will retain the shape. This way you can very quickly change the color to the style you're working on. To use it is very simple. Simply copy the object you want the style from, and then select the object you want to paste the style on, and go to Edit, Paste Style. Or even better, use the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-B. This is something you'll be using all the time when you're illustrating, so I recommend you to memorize the shortcut. Sometimes you want to add some sort of texture or noise to the object or scene you drew. There are many ways you can add noise to an object, but here's what I recommend. Just find some interesting grungy texture online, preferentially from a royalty-free picture site, and import it to the document. You need this texture to be in black and white, so if it's in color, make it black and white by going to Extensions, Raster, HSV, and then set the saturation to -100. There are other ways to desaturate an image in Inkscape, but they might not work well with what we'll do next. Now just place the texture on top of the object or image you want to add the texture to, and then open the Objects dialog. Go to Object, Objects. If you have selected the texture, it should be selected in the dialog. If you remember, here you can set the blend modes of individual objects. I recommend you to try first Multiply for generally light textures or Screen for dark ones. If those don't do it, then you should try each of the other blend modes and see if you get the result you want. Of course, you have to lower the opacity as you try new effects. Always go for subtlety. And finally, of course, you have to clip it to fit your object. Remember that you can use a group as a clip. I want to talk about a couple of nice display options that may help you to work more comfortably. Open the document dialog by going to File, Document. As illustrators, we don't care for most of the options here in this first tab. But if you go down to the section that says Border, you can change a couple of border display options. The most important is the one that lets you disable the page border. I know some artists find a useless black square in the middle annoying and distracting, so now you can just remove it if you like. The second important option here is the section above that says Background. Here you can change the color of the background by clicking in the label. Some artists like to work in a nice gray background rather than a completely white one. But here you can change to any color you want. If you pay attention, you'll see that the alpha is completely turned down. Yet the color of the background changes to the selected color. The alpha option here is for when you export an image. Any area that is not covered by an object, that is, when the background shows through, will export with the transparency set to the value in the alpha slider here. For the most part, you want to have transparency when you export, so I recommend you to leave it all the way down, like it's by default. And if you need your image to have a colored background, just draw a rectangle below with the color of the background you want. Speaking of exporting, you can export any area of the document to a PNG image. Why PNG? Well, the PNG format is a lossless, non-patented image compression format. This means that whatever you export won't lose quality when compressing the image. It'll look as sharp as the vector. Of course, the PNG format allows transparency, so the option in the document about the transparency of the background comes into play when exporting. To export an image, go to File, Export PNG. This will open a dialog. On top there are 4 buttons. Here you can select the type of area that will be automatically selected to export. In reality, these buttons won't matter. What matters are the numeric inputs below. They define the actual area that's going to be exported. I recommend you to always have the button selection to get on. If you have it on, the numeric inputs will adjust to the area of the selected objects. So you can just select the object or objects you want to export, and the area will be set automatically to match the bounding box of the selection. Down below there is the image size section, where you can set the size of the exported file. One important thing to remember here is that because we are working with vectors, the dimension set in the document won't matter at all at the moment of exporting. For example, I can create a rectangle of 100 by 200 pixels. And if I want to export that object, the width and height inputs won't necessarily change to the size of the object. In fact, I can go on and change the value to whatever width and height I want. The values will automatically adapt to the right ratio. So I can easily export that 100 by 200 pixel rectangle to a 10,000 by 20,000 pixel image, and it won't lose any quality. I like to think about it as if you never truly export some object in the document. You export an area of the document, so you can export that area to whatever resolution you want since you're working with vectors. That's the reason why the inputs on top are separated from the width and height input below. Of course, because you cannot stretch an image when exporting, the width and height inputs are locked down to whatever the ratio of the selected area is. Down below is the file name section. Here you can simply set the file name and the location to export the PNG. Finally, once you're done, just click on Export, and the PNG file will be created on your hard drive. The final tip has to do with the color mode with which you select colors. If you remember, in the fill and sort dialog, you get to choose from 5 different modes to select color. In the lesson back then, I told you that you should concentrate in only 2 modes, the wheel and the HSL mode. The wheel doesn't need explanation, it's just a wheel of colors, where you can see the relationship of colors and then set the saturation and value once you pick the hue. However, I think that you should get comfortable with the HSL mode, since it's the most important to picking color for illustration. In art, there is this classical theoretical representation of color that uses 3 variables: hue, saturation, and value. The hue is the actual color picked, can be blue, green, greenish yellow, etc. The saturation is how much quantity of gray the color has. Saturated colors are very vibrant, while desaturated colors are far more pale. Eventually, if you crack down the saturation of a hue, you'll reach full gray. Value is how light or dark a particular color is. At no lightness, the color becomes black. This helps us enormously to represent light and shadow. The HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness, which is the same as value, maps this classic representation. By using this color selection mode, you can compare better the hue, saturation, or value of a color. For example, to imply a surface in shadow, you can sample the color of the surface in light and then lowering slightly the lightness slider. It's very common in illustration to make this type of comparison when selecting colors. So I recommend you to get used to working with the HSL mode.